Scientists announced they sequenced the oldest DNA to date, 2-million-year-old DNA found in Greenland.
For 2 million years, it should have been gone. Not buried, not hidden, gone. In the far north of Greenland, in a place that today looks almost lifeless, scientists pulled something from the Earth that should not have survived the collapse of ages, the grinding of ice, the violence of climate, and the chemistry of time itself. It was not a skeleton. It was not a frozen carcass. It was something stranger. Fragments, microscopic traces, broken signals from a world that no human being had ever seen. And when those fragments were read, they did not describe the Greenland people know now. They described a lost ecosystem, a warmer, greener, biologically richer Arctic, where trees grew, animals moved, and species appeared together in combinations that seem almost impossible from a modern point of view. That was the moment the tension began. Because science is comfortable with caution. It speaks in probabilities, damage patterns, mineral binding, incomplete reference genomes, and the limits of environmental DNA. But the discovery itself was cinematic enough to provoke a much bigger question. If genetic material this old could survive here, what else has history underestimated? What else has been erased only on the surface? Even more unsettling was the setting. This was not some tropical Eden preserved in amber. This was a polar desert, a place so empty today that it seemed incapable of holding such biological memory. Yet beneath that silence, the ground had preserved molecular evidence of a vanished world. Researchers could propose mechanisms. They could model climate. They could compare species. They could reconstruct an ecosystem in outline. But one fact remained almost unnervingly dramatic. The oldest DNA ever retrieved had not led them to a single creature. It had led them to an entire world. And if the Arctic once held a landscape with no true modern equivalent, then the question was no longer just what survived in the sediment. The question was, what kind of Earth had been forgotten there? The confirmed story begins in the Cap Copenhagen Formation in Peary Land, North Greenland. Sediments from this region, dated to roughly 1.9 to 2.1 million years ago, preserved ancient environmental DNA, tiny genetic fragments shed by organisms into their surroundings. In 2022, an international team reported that these fragments represented the oldest DNA ever sequenced, far older than the previous record-holding million-year-old mammoth DNA. The DNA did not come from a complete animal body. It came from sediment, from clay and quartz-rich deposits, where genetic material had been trapped and preserved. By analyzing these fragments, researchers identified a surprisingly diverse ecosystem. Birch, willow, poplar, spruce-like, and other temperate-associated plant signals, along with traces linked to reindeer, geese, hares, rodents, and most dramatically, mastodons. Marine life signals, including horseshoe crab-related traces and algae, suggested that nearby coastal waters were warmer too. The climate context is just as important as the DNA itself. Multiple reports on the study note that North Greenland at the time was far warmer than it is now, roughly 11 to 19 degrees Celsius, warmer on average than the present local environment. What is now a harsh polar desert appears to have once supported a mixed ecosystem of Arctic and temperate species with no exact modern equivalent. The debates begin with interpretation, not with the existence of the DNA. Researchers broadly accept that the DNA is ancient and that it reveals a richer ecosystem than fossils alone had shown. But they are more careful when describing exactly how that ecosystem functioned. Environmental DNA can reveal that species were present in a landscape or sedimentary system. It does not always prove that every species identified lived side by side at the same exact moment. Some material may have been transported within the environment before burial. There is also debate over taxonomic precision. Because ancient DNA fragments are extremely short and damaged, and because modern reference genomes are incomplete, some sequences can only be identified confidently to family or genus level, rather than to a precise extinct species. The mastodon signal is one of the most famous and most striking results. But even there, scientists are careful to discuss assignment methods and limits. Read counts also do not translate neatly into actual population size or ecosystem dominance. A second area of debate involves preservation itself. Researchers propose that mineral surfaces in the sediment, especially clay and quartz-rich environments, may have helped bind and protect DNA over immense timescales. But the full taphonomic story, meaning the exact journey of DNA from living organism to buried molecule, remains an active research question. Later work has emphasized that mineral composition, transport, and depositional context can strongly shape what environmental DNA appears to say about an ecosystem. The most speculative layer begins where the evidence ends. Some people leap from this discovery to the idea that ancient DNA can perfectly recreate lost worlds in cinematic detail. It cannot. It can reveal presence, relationships, and environmental signals, but not the full visual, seasonal, or behavioral reality of that ecosystem. Another speculative leap is that the discovery proves ancient species could rapidly adapt to future warming in the same way modern life might. Researchers have suggested the Greenland ecosystem may offer clues about biological adaptability, but they also warn that ancient adaptation unfolded over vast stretches of time. Today's warming is happening much faster, which makes direct comparison risky. And finally, there is the biggest misconception of all, that scientists found something they cannot explain, in the sense of a supernatural anomaly. That is not what the evidence shows. What unsettles researchers is not that the discovery is beyond science. It is that the mechanisms of survival, transport, and preservation are more complex than earlier models allowed, and the implications are larger than expected. The anomaly is not merely the age, it is the contradiction. DNA is fragile, it breaks, it degrades, it is attacked by water, oxygen, heat, radiation, microbes, and time. For years, even experts doubted whether genetic material could survive beyond a certain threshold. Yet in northern Greenland, from sediments nearly 2 million years old, it did. Or at least enough of it did to tell a story. That alone would have been extraordinary. But the deeper anomaly was ecological. The reconstructed world did not look like a simple ancient Arctic. It looked like a hybrid, a mixed environment where species associated with cold climates appeared alongside organisms more consistent with warmer conditions. Trees and shrubs, herbivores, marine warmth indicators, even mastodons, animals more familiar from North America than from the high Arctic imagination. That created a curiosity gap no fossil map had fully closed. Before this, animal fossils from Cap Copenhagen were painfully sparse. A hair tooth, a dung beetle, little more. The landscape was giving almost nothing away. Then suddenly, sedimentary DNA opened the door and revealed not one missing animal, but a whole ecosystem of hidden diversity. And this is where the story becomes more than a discovery headline. Because if a nearly lifeless Arctic desert can preserve the molecular memory of a forested, warmer, biologically active world, then the silence of the landscape can no longer be trusted. The emptiest places on Earth may not be empty in historical terms at all. The ground was not just holding evidence. It was holding contradiction. A frozen place pointing to warmth. A barren place pointing to abundance. A dead-looking terrain carrying traces of a vanished biological frontier. And behind all of it was the most unsettling scientific question of the story. If this much history survived where almost no one expected it, how much ancient Earth is still invisible simply because no one has learned how to read the sediment yet? The breakthrough did not come from one miracle sample, it came from convergence. First, there was the fieldwork sediment cores and samples collected from a place so remote and so geologically unforgiving that its modern appearance gives almost no hint of the world buried beneath it. Then came dating, contamination control, and high-throughput sequencing able to read tiny, damaged fragments that older techniques might have dismissed as meaningless noise. Just as important was the concept of environmental DNA, eDNA. Instead of waiting for a beautifully preserved skeleton, scientists read the genetic residue organisms leave behind in soil and sediment, skin cells, waste, decaying tissue, and trace biological material carried into a deposit over time. In a fossil-poor site like Cap Copenhagen, that changed everything. It allowed the ecosystem to be approached indirectly, almost like reconstructing a crime scene from molecules rather than bodies. There was also a second breakthrough, quieter but equally important, a change in scientific humility. Earlier models underestimated how long DNA might survive. The Greenland discovery forced a revision. Researchers suggested that the DNA's bond with mineral particles, particularly in clay and quartz-rich sediment, may have dramatically slowed its degradation. Later work on eDNA taphonomy has reinforced the idea that mineral surfaces, transport processes, and depositional environments shape what survives and how it should be interpreted. If artificial intelligence enters this story, it should be described realistically. AI can help with pattern recognition, sequence sorting, taxonomic matching, error filtering, and comparing damaged DNA fragments against large genomic databases. It can accelerate interpretation. It can suggest likely relationships, but it cannot magically restore a complete genome from almost nothing. And it cannot tell scientists what the weather felt like, what the ecosystem looked like in motion, or whether every detected species stood in the same clearing at the same time. AI is an assistant here, not an oracle. What made the discovery powerful was not that machines solved the past. It was that new tools, computational, chemical, geological, and genetic, finally became good enough to hear a signal that had been trapped in the Earth for 2 million years. The first ideal insertion point comes right after the audience hears that a polar desert once held a forested ecosystem. At that exact emotional turn, a short field clip from a real science news package can ground the revelation. The second ideal insertion point comes immediately after the mention of mastodons in Greenland. That is the story beat where disbelief peaks, and a verified documentary or science channel visual can keep the audience emotionally anchored while the narration continues. This is where the story widens, because once the oldest DNA record was pushed back to around 2 million years, the implications extended far beyond Greenland. The discovery hinted that ancient ecosystems may be recoverable from places long considered scientifically silent. If sediments can preserve molecular evidence this deep in time, then some of prehistory's lost environments may not be entirely lost after all. But this is also where the experts slow the narrative down. Not because the discovery is weak, but because its implications are powerful enough to be misused. Some researchers emphasize the broad ecological promise. eDNA can reveal hidden diversity, fill fossil gaps, and reconstruct vanished worlds at a scale bones alone often cannot. Others respond with caution. Environmental DNA is not a perfect snapshot. Sediments can mix signals. Rivers and coastal systems can transport material. Rare species can be missed. Overconfident taxonomic assignments can mislead if reference genomes are incomplete. There is institutional caution too. Museums, universities, and research teams know that the most dramatic headline is often the least precise. Scientists can't explain is powerful language, but in reality, scientists can explain parts of the phenomenon. Cold conditions mattered, mineral binding mattered, sediment chemistry mattered. What remains uncertain is the full preservation pathway and how broadly the same mechanism can be expected elsewhere. That is not ignorance. That is disciplined science. And then there is the climate tension. Some have pointed to the ancient Greenland ecosystem as evidence that life can adapt to warming. In a limited sense, that may be true. But serious researchers do not present this as comfort. They emphasize timescale. Ancient ecosystems changed over immense periods, giving species opportunities modern warming may not allow. The old Arctic can illuminate resilience, but it does not erase the danger of rapid present-day climate change. So the stakes rise on two fronts at once. Scientifically, the discovery expands what ancient DNA may be capable of. Philosophically, it forces a confrontation with how unstable Earth's normal really is. Because the Greenland people see today may be only the latest surface version of a place whose deeper history has been almost unimaginably different. There are at least 3 ways to read this discovery. 1. The conventional scientific explanation. The strongest mainstream interpretation is that the Kapkubenhaven sediments preserved authentic environmental DNA from a real, early Pleistocene ecosystem in North Greenland. This ecosystem existed during a much warmer climatic window and included a mix of Arctic and temperate species. The DNA survived because of an unusual combination of cold, burial, mineral binding, and favorable sediment chemistry. In this view, the discovery is revolutionary, but not mystical. It is a triumph of method. 2. The broader alternative interpretation. A more expansive interpretation says, the Greenland discovery is not just one remarkable paper. It may be the beginning of a new map of the ancient world. If DNA this old can survive in the right sediments, then ancient environments once thought permanently inaccessible may become readable. Lost ecosystems in the Arctic, and perhaps in other mineral-rich settings, could force major revisions in how scientists reconstruct evolution, migration, and climatic adaptation. This reading is ambitious, but it stays within the boundaries of scientific possibility. SAN. The skeptical position. The skeptical position is not that the discovery is false, but that its storytelling is often too smooth. Skeptics note that environmental DNA is interpretive by nature. It is extraordinarily valuable, but it is not the same as standing in a time machine. Species detection is not identical to proving direct coexistence in one visual scene. Some DNA may be transported, some taxa may be over or underrepresented. Some assignments remain limited by incomplete databases. In this reading, the real danger is cinematic overreach, turning a probabilistic reconstruction into an overly literal, lost world tableau. And yet, all three interpretations agree on one thing. Something extraordinary was preserved in Greenland, something old enough to redraw the limits of ancient DNA, something strong enough to reveal that the Arctic had once been part of a world far stranger than the modern eye expects. Why does this matter so much? Because this story is not really about a laboratory record. It is about the instability of certainty. Modern people tend to imagine landscapes as fixed identities. Desert means desert, ice means ice. The Arctic means extremity, emptiness, survival at the edge of life. But the oldest DNA ever retrieved says something profoundly humbling. Even the most permanent-looking places on Earth may only be temporary versions of themselves. That changes the emotional center of the story. Greenland stops being just a frozen frontier. It becomes evidence that worlds vanish without disappearing entirely. They can leave no monument, no intact skeleton, no towering ruin, and still survive in fragments so small they are invisible to the eye. Not in stone inscriptions, not in myth, in chemistry. There is something deeply unsettling in that. It means the past is not always dead enough to stay silent. It also changes how history is imagined. Traditionally, lost worlds are recovered through architecture, fossils, or written records. Here, an ecosystem was recovered through molecular debris through residue. That shifts the scale of what can count as memory. The Earth is not only an archive of bones and rock, it is, under the right conditions, an archive of traces. And that matters now, in the age of climate anxiety. Because the discovery does not merely reveal that warmth once transformed the Arctic, it reveals that ecosystems can be radically rearranged, that combinations of life can emerge with no exact modern counterpart, and that what seems impossible from the present may simply belong to a different climate reality. At the same time, it warns that adaptation in the deep past happened across immense timescales that modern species may not have. So the story leaves behind two opposite emotions at once. Wonder because a lost ecosystem has spoken again, and dread because it spoke from a warmer Arctic. In the end, the oldest DNA ever retrieved did not simply identify an organism. It exposed a contradiction in the human imagination. A place assumed barren had once been alive, in ways almost no one would have guessed. A landscape associated with silence had preserved one of the loudest scientific revelations of the century. And the molecules left behind did more than break a record. They reopened the question of what Earth has been before and what it could become again. Scientists can describe the fragments. They can model the climate. They can propose how the DNA endured. But the deeper mystery remains larger than the method. How many vanished worlds are still buried beneath places people think they already understand? Because perhaps the greatest scientific shock is not that this ecosystem was lost. It is that it was never truly gone. It was waiting in the sediment, in the dark, in pieces too small to see until the right century arrived to read them. And if one of the coldest, emptiest places on Earth can hide the memory of forests, herbivores, and warmth from 2 million years ago, then what other impossible histories are still sleeping beneath the surface? That is the question this discovery leaves behind. And that is where the story stays open. If this lost Arctic ecosystem was only the first one ancient DNA has brought back into view, then what forgotten world should science look for next? History does not always survive as ruins. Sometimes it survives as residue, and sometimes the smallest fragment carries the largest warning. What do you think this discovery really changes ancient history, climate science, or the limits of what can still be recovered from the past? Let the audience decide in the comments.